Every Monday and Thursday evening for the past 19 years, I have driven my old 1962 Chevrolet pickup along the winding mountain road, parked at the same weathered pullout near the old fire tower, and walked the familiar 3/4-mile path to leave food at the massive hollow oak that stands at the edge of the deep woods. My husband thinks I am feeding the wild turkeys that roam these hills. My neighbors, what few I have in this remote corner of the world, assume I am some kind of eccentric nature lover with too much time on her hands. The truth is something far more extraordinary, something that most people would never believe, even if I swore on a stack of Bibles. I have been leaving food for the same creature since 1953, a being that exists in legend and campfire tales, but whom I know to be as real as the ancient mountains that surround my home. My name is Eleanor Whitmore and I am 55 years old. I have spent most of my adult life working as a forestry surveyor in these Appalachian mountains of West Virginia, first as a young field assistant fresh out of college, then as a senior surveyor, and now in my semi-retirement as a consultant for the State Parks Department. These forests are woven into my very soul. I was born within sight of these ridges, raised in a cabin not 5 miles from where I now live, and I expect I will die with the smell of pine and hemlock in my nostrils. But it was not until the autumn of 1953 that I truly understood I was not alone in these ancient hollows, that something else called these misty mountains home, something remarkable and deserving of protection, something that would change my life forever. That Monday evening in October of 1972 was cool and still, with the first hints of autumn color touching the highest ridges, the kind of evening that makes you stop and simply breathe in the beauty of the world. I loaded the bed of my old truck with the usual supplies: a canvas bag containing fresh pears from my small orchard, smoked ham from the pig we had butchered last fall, a large jar of blackberry preserves I had put up in August, and a fresh loaf of cornbread I had baked that very morning. Simple things, humble offerings, but ones I knew would be received with appreciation. The drive up the mountain road took nearly half an hour, my truck groaning over the rough gravel and exposed roots that made up what passed for a road in these parts. I passed the ruins of the old Whitmore Coal Company operation, my grandfather's enterprise, abandoned now for nearly 15 years since the seams had played out and the bigger companies had moved their operations further south. The forests here were slowly healing, young oaks and maples and tulip poplars reclaiming the scarred hillsides that had been stripped bare in my grandmother's time. I parked in my usual spot, a small clearing where an old logging skid had once been, and shouldered my pack. The evening air smelled of leaf mold and wood smoke from some distant cabin, and somewhere down in the hollow, a barred owl was already beginning its evening calls. I had walked this trail so many times I could navigate it in complete darkness, past the massive boulder we called Preacher's Rock, down through the rhododendron thicket that grew so dense it blocked out the sky, across the little creek that ran cold and clear over smooth stones, and finally up the gentle slope to where the ancient oak stood like a sentinel at the edge of the deep wilderness. The oak was easily 400 years old, perhaps older. Its trunk was so massive that 3 grown adults could not have joined hands around it. Lightning had struck it sometime in the distant past, hollowing out the center and creating a natural shelter that was perfect for my purposes. Protected from the frequent mountain rains, hidden from the occasional hiker who ventured this far from the marked trails, and positioned at the very edge of territory I had come to recognize as hers. I unpacked my offerings carefully, arranging them in the hollow space as I had done hundreds of times before. Then I stepped back, looked around at the familiar forest, now growing dim in the fading light, and allowed my mind to drift back to the first time I had come to this place. 19 years and another lifetime ago. Autumn of 1953. I was 36 years old then, a senior forestry surveyor working a section of old-growth forest about 3 miles from where I now stood. It was late October, and we had already had our first hard frost. The leaves were falling fast, carpeting the ground in shades of gold and crimson and brown, and the air had that crisp edge that told you winter was not far behind. I was working alone that day, conducting a timber survey for a proposed selective harvest. My job was to mark the trees that could be taken without damaging the forest's overall health, to map the terrain, and to note any features that should be preserved. It was solitary work, quiet work, and I preferred it that way. There was something pure about being alone in the forest, with nothing but my thoughts and the sounds of nature for company. I had just finished measuring and marking a cluster of large white oaks when I heard it. A deep, resonant call that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the rocky outcrops and filtering through the dense canopy. It was unlike any animal sound I had ever encountered in all my years in these mountains. Not a bear, not a bobcat, not an elk. It had a quality that made something ancient and primal stir in my chest, a recognition of something powerful and unknown that bypassed my rational mind entirely and spoke directly to instincts I did not know I possessed. I stood perfectly still, my pencil frozen above my survey notebook, listening. The call came again, closer this time, from somewhere in the dense laurel thicket to the east. My first instinct was to head back to the road, to my truck and safety, but something held me in place. Curiosity, perhaps, or something deeper. I had spent my entire adult life in these woods and had never heard anything like that sound. If I walked away now, I knew I would wonder about it for the rest of my days. I moved quietly through the fallen leaves, stepping carefully to minimize the crunching sounds, following game trails when I could and pushing through thick vegetation when I had to. After about 20 minutes, I found tracks. They were pressed deep into the soft earth near a small spring, and the shape made my breath catch in my throat. Footprints easily 17 inches long with 5 distinct toes, clearly visible in the mud. They were deep, suggesting something of considerable weight, and spaced far apart, indicating a stride much longer than any human could manage. I followed the tracks for another 15 minutes, my heart pounding so loud in my ears I was certain anything within a mile could hear it. The trail led me to a small clearing on a south-facing slope, sheltered from the wind by a rocky outcrop. And there, partially hidden in the deep shadows beneath a massive hemlock, I saw her for the first time. She was enormous. I estimated at least 7.5 feet tall, possibly more. Her body was covered in dark reddish-brown hair, longer and thicker around her shoulders and the top of her head, where it almost looked like a wild mane. She was facing partially away from me, crouched down beside what I realized was a recently killed deer, a young doe that had probably been weakened by disease or injury. But she was not eating. Instead, she seemed to be examining the carcass carefully, methodically, in a way that suggested intelligence and purpose. I watched, barely breathing, afraid that any movement would alert her to my presence. Her hands, and they were clearly hands despite their size, moved with surprising delicacy as she worked. And then she made a sound, a lower, softer version of the call I'd heard before. Within moments, 2 smaller figures emerged from behind the rocky outcrop. They were juveniles, I realized, maybe 4 feet tall, moving with the awkward energy of youth, her offspring. And suddenly, the entire scene made perfect sense. She was a mother, teaching her young how to process food, how to survive in the wild. The female made another sound, and the juveniles approached the deer carcass. She guided them with gestures and vocalizations, showing them something, perhaps what parts were safe to eat, perhaps how to efficiently butcher the animal. I could not be certain of the specifics, but it was clearly instruction, clearly teaching. This was not simple animal behavior. This was something far more sophisticated, far more human. I must have made some small sound. Perhaps my boot slipped on a loose stone. Perhaps I simply gasped without realizing it, because suddenly the adult female's head snapped in my direction. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we made eye contact across the clearing. Her eyes were dark, deeply intelligent, and filled with an awareness that made something fundamental shift inside me. She did not charge, did not roar or display aggression. Instead, she gathered her young with a gesture that was unmistakably protective and loving, and they moved quickly but calmly into the forest, disappearing within seconds as if they had never been there at all. I stood there for a very long time after they had vanished, trying to process what I had witnessed, trying to reconcile the evidence of my own eyes with everything I had been taught about what was and was not possible in this world. That evening, back at my small cabin, I said nothing to my husband Robert about what I had seen. What could I say? That I had encountered Bigfoot, that I had watched a Sasquatch mother teaching her children. He would have thought I had lost my mind, or that I had been sampling the moonshine that still flowed freely in these hills despite being technically illegal. But I could not stop thinking about that family, because that is exactly what they were, a family, a mother with children struggling to survive and raise her young just as any human mother would. The next morning, I packed extra food in my survey bag, leftover biscuits, some dried apple slices, a piece of salt pork. During my lunch break, I hiked back to that clearing and left the food near where I had seen them. I had no idea if they would take it. I did not even know if they would find it or if some other animal would get to it first. But I felt compelled to try. Something about the intelligence in that mother's eyes had spoken to me, had created a connection that I could not ignore. 3 days later, I returned to the clearing. The food was gone, and there were fresh tracks in the soft earth around where I had left it. Tracks that matched the ones I had followed before. So I left more food, and more the following week, and the week after that. That autumn of 1953 had been the start of something extraordinary. A relationship that had now spanned nearly 2 decades, built on nothing more than regular offerings, patient observation, and mutual respect. Over the years, I had learned her patterns, her preferences, her routines. She preferred fruits and preserves to meat, though she would take smoked ham or bacon when offered. She seemed to have a particular fondness for anything sweet. She was cautious and deliberate, never approaching the offering site while I was anywhere nearby. In the early years, I never saw her at all during my visits. I would simply leave the food and find it gone when I returned. But over time, that changed. I would catch glimpses of her in the distance, watching me from the shadows. Then she began to show herself more openly, always from a safe distance, always ready to disappear into the forest at the first sign of anything threatening. The first time she allowed me to see her clearly, without immediately retreating, was in the spring of 1958. Almost 5 years after our first encounter. I had arrived at the oak tree to find her standing at the edge of the clearing, not hiding, not running, just watching me with those intelligent, assessing eyes. We stood there for perhaps 5 minutes, neither of us moving, neither of us looking away. Then she made a gesture that I interpreted as greeting, touching her chest and then extending her hand toward me. I returned the gesture instinctively, touching my own chest and extending my hand. She made a low vocalization, almost like a hum of satisfaction, and then melted back into the forest. It felt like we had crossed some invisible threshold, established some basic protocol of acknowledgement. From that day forward, our interactions became more regular, more sustained. By 1960, I had learned that she was not alone. There was an entire community of them living in these deep woods, perhaps a dozen individuals that I had confirmed through tracks and occasional sightings. She seemed to be the leader of the group, the decision maker, the one who determined what was safe and what was dangerous. The two juveniles I had seen that first day had grown into young adults, and there were others, including what appeared to be an elderly male with almost entirely grey hair, who moved slowly and carefully, and another adult female who seemed to be pregnant. I gave them names in my own mind, names that helped me keep track of them and remember their individual characteristics. The leader I called Tara, the old male I called Grandfather, the pregnant female I called Hope, the two young adults from that first sighting I called Dawn and Dusk, because one had lighter coloring and one had darker. By 1965, my Monday and Thursday visits had become as fixed a part of my routine as eating breakfast or brushing my teeth. Robert had long since stopped asking questions about my regular trips up the mountain, accepting my vague explanations about checking on the forest, monitoring wildlife, maintaining my survey markers. He was a good man, patient and understanding, even when he did not fully comprehend what I was doing. Perhaps he suspected something of the truth. Perhaps he had noticed that I always came back from these trips with a particular light in my eyes, a peacefulness that ordinary forest walks could not explain, but if he knew or guessed, he never pressed me about it. In the autumn of 1967, something changed in our relationship. I arrived at the Hollow Oak one Monday evening to find Tara waiting for me, not at the edge of the clearing as she sometimes did, but right beside the tree, close enough that I could have reached out and touched her. She was holding something in her massive hand, and as I approached, she extended it toward me. It was a small carving, a piece of wood that had been shaped and smoothed into a recognizable form. A human figure, simple but unmistakable, with arms extended in the gesture we had come to use as greeting. She had made this. She had created art, a representation of me, and she was giving it to me as a gift. I accepted it with trembling hands, overwhelmed by what this meant. This was not the behavior of an animal. This was the action of a person, a being capable of abstract thought, symbolic representation, and deliberate gift-giving. "Thank you," I said, though I did not know if she could understand my words. "Thank you for this. I will treasure it always." She made a low sound that I had come to recognize as contentment or satisfaction. Then she touched her chest and made a vocalization that sounded something like her name. "Tara," she said, or something close to it. She was telling me her name, not the name I had given her in my mind, but her real name, the one her own people used. I repeated it back to her as best I could. "Tara." She made the contentment sound again, and then she made another vocalization, pointing at me. She wanted to know my name. "Eleanor," I said, touching my own chest. "My name is Eleanor." She tried to repeat it, producing something that sounded like Elnor. Close enough. From that day forward, I was Elnor to her and her people. We had exchanged names, crossed another threshold in our relationship. I was no longer just the strange human who left food. I was a person with an identity, someone worth knowing. The autumn of 1971 brought a crisis that would test everything I had built with Tara and her community. It began on a Monday evening in early October. I arrived at the Hollow Oak to find Tara waiting for me, but not in her usual calm manner. She was agitated, pacing back and forth at the edge of the clearing, making sounds I had never heard before. Distress calls, I realized. Something was very wrong. She approached me urgently, gesturing for me to follow. This was unprecedented. In all our years of interaction, she had never asked me to come into their territory, into the deep forest where they made their home. The boundary had always been the Hollow Oak, a neutral meeting place where we could interact without me intruding on their private space. But now she was clearly asking me to cross that boundary. Something was wrong enough that she was willing to break the established rules. I followed her without hesitation. She led me deep into the forest, through terrain I had never traversed despite all my years in these woods. We traveled for perhaps an hour, climbing over ridges and descending into hollows, pushing through rhododendron thickets so dense they blocked out the fading evening light. Finally, we emerged into a hidden valley I had never known existed, a sanctuary surrounded by rocky cliffs on three sides and accessible only through the narrow passage we had just traveled. This was their home, their base, the center of their territory. The entire community was gathered in the valley, arranged in a loose circle around a natural shelter formed by an overhanging rock ledge. The atmosphere was heavy with tension and grief. As I approached, guided by Tara's hand on my shoulder, the circle parted to let me through. And then I saw what had caused such distress. The female I had named Hope, but whose real name I had learned was Kina, was there, huddled at the back of the shelter, holding a small bundle in her arms. It was her newest baby, born just that summer, a tiny creature I had only seen from a distance during previous visits. But something was clearly wrong. The baby was limp, making weak sounds of distress, and even in the dim light I could see that her movements were sluggish, uncoordinated. Kina looked up at me, with eyes full of desperate hope, and I understood immediately why Tara had brought me here. They knew I was different from them. They knew I had access to things they did not. They were hoping I could help. I approached slowly, carefully, not wanting to frighten Kina or add to her distress. The other members of the community watched silently, their eyes following my every movement. This was either going to be a breakthrough or a disaster. If I could help, I would cement my relationship with them in a way that could never be undone. If I failed, or if I did something that hurt the baby, I might lose everything I had built over nearly 2 decades. "May I see her?" I asked, not knowing if Kina would understand my words, but hoping my tone would convey my intentions. "May I look at the baby?" Tara made a sound, something directed at her sister. Kina hesitated, then slowly, reluctantly, extended the baby toward me. The infant was tiny, perhaps 15 pounds, covered in soft fur that was matted with sweat. Her eyes were half closed, her breathing rapid and shallow. When I gently touched her forehead, the heat radiating from her small body told me immediately what was wrong. "She has a fever," I said. "She is sick. I need to find out what is wrong." I examined the baby as carefully as I could, acutely aware that every eye in the community was watching me. Her ears looked clean, no sign of infection there. Her throat was not swollen or red. Her belly seemed normal when I gently palpated it. But when I checked her mouth, I found it. A small tooth was emerging from her gum, surrounded by red, inflamed tissue that had clearly become infected. Teething. The baby was teething, and the gum had become infected, causing a fever that could be dangerous if left untreated. "I understand," I said, more to myself than to anyone else. "I know what is wrong, but I need medicine. I need to come back with medicine." I tried to explain to Tara, using gestures and simple words. I made the motion of leaving and returning. I pointed at the baby and mimed giving her something. I did not know how much she understood, but she seemed to grasp that I needed to leave and come back with something that could help. She made a sound of acknowledgement and gestured for one of the younger adults to escort me back to the boundary of their territory. I do not think I have ever driven as fast as I did that night, racing down the mountain road with my headlights cutting through the darkness, my mind spinning through possibilities. The baby needed antibiotics, something to fight the infection. But I could not simply walk into a pharmacy and request medicine for what I would have to describe as a very large, very hairy infant. I needed to think of another approach. Robert was asleep when I got home, and I did not wake him. Instead, I went to the small barn where we kept our few livestock and found what I was looking for: a bottle of veterinary penicillin that I kept on hand for treating sick animals. It was not ideal, but it would work. I calculated a dosage appropriate for the baby's estimated weight, measured it out into a small bottle, and added a jar of honey to help make the medicine more palatable. The next morning, I told Robert I had to go back up the mountain urgently, that I had found signs of a sick animal that needed help. He accepted this explanation without question, as he always did. Within an hour, I was hiking back up the trail, my pack heavy with the medicine and additional supplies. Tara was waiting for me at the hollow oak, and together we made the journey back to the hidden valley. The baby had worsened overnight. Her fever was higher, her cries weaker. Kina was frantic, holding her daughter tightly, clearly afraid to let anyone near. Tara had to coax her sister for several minutes before Kina would allow me to approach again. I mixed the penicillin with honey, creating a sweet mixture that I hoped the baby would accept. Then, with Kina supporting the baby's head, I carefully administered the medicine, using a smooth stick as a primitive spoon to get the mixture into the baby's mouth. The waiting that followed was the longest of my life. I stayed in the valley for hours, watching over the sick infant, checking her temperature by touch, administering additional doses of the medicine at regular intervals. The community remained gathered around us, a silent vigil of hope and anxiety. By the second day, the baby's fever began to break. By the third day, she was nursing again, her cries stronger, her movements more energetic. By the end of the week, she was clearly on the road to recovery, her gum healing, her temperature normal, her spirit returning. I had done it. I had saved her. The community's response to the baby's recovery was unlike anything I had ever experienced. They gathered around me, all 15 of them, making sounds of joy and relief. Kina brought the baby to me. She was healthy now, alert and curious, reaching out with tiny hands to touch my face. Kina made a sound, a name. Luna, she said, or something close to it. The baby's name. Luna, I repeated. Hello, Luna. You gave us quite a scare, little one. Kina made another sound, and then she did something that brought tears to my eyes. She took my hand and placed it on Luna's chest, over her heart. Then she made the greeting gesture and added a new touch from her chest to mine. I understood. She was acknowledging me as part of Luna's extended family. She was thanking me in the most profound way her people knew. The months that followed the crisis deepened my relationship with the community in ways I never could have anticipated. My Monday and Thursday visits continued, but now they often extended into the hidden valley itself. Tara and her people had accepted me fully, welcoming me into their private sanctuary. Luna grew quickly, transforming from a fragile infant into a robust and energetic toddler. She had a particular fondness for me, always seeking me out when I visited, climbing on me with the fearless confidence of the very young. Robert eventually noticed the changes in my routine. The longer visits, the greater quantities of food I was taking up the mountain. One evening, as I was preparing for my Thursday trip, he finally asked the question he had been holding back for years. Eleanor, he said, sitting down at the kitchen table with the expression of a man who has decided to confront something he has been avoiding. What is really going on up there? You have been making these trips for nearly 20 years. I have never questioned it because I trust you, but I think I deserve to know the truth. I sat down across from him, looking at the man I had been married to for 32 years, the father of our grown children, my partner in every aspect of life except this one secret I had kept hidden. I thought about lying, making up some story about a research project or a conservation effort, but I could not. Robert deserved the truth. And perhaps I was tired of carrying this secret alone. I told him everything. The first encounter in 1953, the years of leaving food, the slow building of trust, Tara and her people, Luna's illness and recovery, all of it. I talked for nearly 2 hours while he listened without interruption, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, wonder, concern, and finally something that looked like acceptance. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked the question I had been dreading. Why did you never tell me before? I was afraid, I admitted. Afraid you would think I was crazy. Afraid you would want to tell someone, alert the authorities, bring scientists and reporters. I was afraid of anything that might put them at risk. He reached across the table and took my hand. Eleanor, he said, I have been married to you for over 30 years. I know you. You are the most rational, level-headed person I have ever met. If you say these creatures exist, if you say you have been building a relationship with them for nearly 20 years, then I believe you, and I would never do anything to put that at risk. The relief that washed over me was overwhelming. I had carried this secret for so long, hidden it from the person closest to me, and now that burden was lifted. Robert had questions, of course, hundreds of questions, and over the following weeks I answered all of them. I showed him my journal, my notes, the small carved figure that Tara had given me. And having someone to share it with, someone who believed me and supported me, made everything easier. The world outside the forest changed dramatically over the decades that followed. Technology advanced, society transformed, the certainties of one generation gave way to the uncertainties of the next. But in that hidden valley in the heart of the Appalachian wilderness, life continued as it had for countless generations. Babies were born, young ones grew. The old passed on their wisdom and eventually passed away. The cycle continued, as eternal as the mountains themselves. I am an old woman now, past 80, and the hike up to the hollow oak has become difficult for me. Some visits, Robert has to drive me most of the way, and I have to rest several times on the trail. But I still go every Monday and Thursday, carrying my offerings of food, maintaining the relationship I began over 40 years ago. Tara is old too, moving with the careful deliberation of advanced age, her once vibrant reddish-brown fur now almost entirely grey. Luna is a grandmother herself, the leader of her own family group within the larger community. The community continues to thrive, its traditions intact, its way of life preserved in this sanctuary I have helped to protect. I do not know how much longer I will be able to make these visits. The body weakens, even when the spirit remains strong. But I have made arrangements, careful preparations for the time when I can no longer come myself. My granddaughter Sarah has been told the truth, sworn to secrecy, and has agreed to continue the offerings when I am gone. She is a young woman of good character and deep respect for nature, and I believe she will honor the trust I have built. The relationship will continue, passed down through my family, just as Tara's leadership was passed down through hers. Some people spend their lives searching for proof of the extraordinary, for evidence that the world contains wonders beyond our everyday experience. They set up cameras, organize expeditions, write books arguing for the existence of creatures that most people dismiss as myth and legend. I understand their desire, the urge to prove what you know to be true, to share the wonder with others, to validate your own experience. But I learned long ago that some things are more important than proof. Some relationships are too precious to risk for the sake of recognition or validation. I have never told my story publicly, never sought fame or acknowledgement for what I have witnessed. This account, which I write now in my twilight years, is for my family alone, a record to be passed down with the responsibility of continuing the relationship I began. Perhaps someday the world will be ready to know that creatures like Tara and her people exist, that intelligence and emotion and family love are not unique to humanity. Perhaps someday their existence can be acknowledged and protected without putting them at risk. But that day is not today, and I will not be the one to force it. What I have learned in 40 years of friendship with these remarkable beings is simple but profound. The boundaries we draw between human and animal, between civilization and wilderness, between us and them, are not as solid as we imagine. Intelligence takes many forms. Love transcends species. Family is defined by bonds of care and loyalty, not by genetics or appearance. And sometimes, if you are very patient and very fortunate, you are granted the privilege of crossing those boundaries, of forming connections that enrich your life in ways you never could have anticipated. I am grateful for every Monday and Thursday visit, every offering left at the Hollow Oak, every moment of connection with Tara and her people. I am grateful for the trust they extended to me, a stranger from another world, and for the family they allowed me to become part of. I am grateful for the gift of knowing that the wilderness holds wonders, that the world is more remarkable than we imagine, that we are not alone in our capacity for love and grief and joy. The last time I saw Tara clearly was on a Thursday evening in early autumn. The leaves were just beginning to turn, hints of gold and crimson appearing on the highest ridges, and the air had that familiar crisp edge that told of winter approaching. I made my way slowly up the trail, resting often, feeling every one of my 83 years in my aching joints and laboring lungs. The pack on my shoulders, once so easy to carry, now felt like a tremendous burden. But I carried it anyway, as I had carried it for 4 decades, because some things are more important than physical comfort. She was waiting for me at the Hollow Oak, standing in the open without any attempt at concealment, her grey fur silver in the fading light. She was thin, I noticed, thinner than she had been. Age had caught up with her, as it had caught up with me. We were both at the end of our journeys, she and I, 2 old women who had spent a lifetime building something extraordinary. I unpacked my offerings and arranged them in the hollow, as I had done thousands of times before. Simple things: a jar of honey, some dried fruit, fresh bread baked that morning. The offerings had not changed much over the years, though the hands that prepared them had grown spotted and trembling with age. When I turned back, Tara had approached. She stood close enough to touch, her massive form towering over my stooped frame, her dark eyes meeting mine with the intelligence and awareness I'd first recognized 40 years ago. Neither of us spoke. We had never needed many words between us. She reached out and placed her hand on my shoulder, that familiar gesture of connection. I placed my own hand over hers, marveling as always at the warmth, the solidity, the undeniable reality of her presence. We stood like that for a long moment, 2 old friends saying goodbye in the only way that mattered. Then she made a sound, low and gentle, and in it I heard everything: gratitude, love, understanding, farewell. "Thank you," I whispered, "for everything." She turned then and walked into the forest, disappearing into the gathering darkness, as she had done so many times before. But this time, I knew, was different. This time felt like an ending. I stood at the Hollow Oak for a long time after she was gone, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, listening to the night sounds of the forest I had loved all my life. Then I picked up my empty pack and began the long walk back down the mountain, back to Robert, who would be waiting with dinner on the table and questions in his eyes, back to the life I had built in the world of humans. But part of me stayed in that forest, as it always had. Part of me belonged to the mountains and the ancient trees and the remarkable beings who called them home. That part would never leave, no matter how far I traveled, no matter how many years passed. That part was home. Some stories do not have endings, not really. They simply continue in different forms, passed from one generation to the next, evolving and adapting, but never truly concluding. My story with Tara and her people is like that. It will not end when I die. Sarah will take my place, carrying offerings up the mountain, maintaining the relationship I built, and perhaps someday her children will continue the tradition, and their children after them. A chain of connection stretching forward into a future I will never see. I do not know what that future holds. Perhaps the world will become more hostile to these creatures, more dangerous. Perhaps development will encroach on their territory, forcing them to retreat to ever more remote locations. Or perhaps the world will change in ways that make their existence easier, that allow them to emerge from the shadows and take their rightful place as our neighbors, our fellow inhabitants of this remarkable planet. I do not know, I can only hope. But whatever happens, I know this. The relationship matters. The connection matters. The simple act of showing up week after week, year after year, decade after decade, with offerings and respect and the willingness to cross boundaries matters. It matters because it proves that different worlds can touch, that understanding is possible, that love transcends the categories we create to separate ourselves from each other and from the rest of creation. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I'm 83 years old. And for the past 40 years, I've been feeding a family of extraordinary beings who most people believe exist only in legend and campfire tales. They are real, they are intelligent, they are compassionate, and they have been watching over these mountains and over us for far longer than anyone knows. This is my story. This is their story. This is our story together.